René, my feed on LinkedIn and on the radio, I hear a lot about a new report that was written by the Dutch government, who did a research on how the cloud is being used within the government in the Netherlands. So they try to assess themselves, which I think is really good. But what I read on all the posts on LinkedIn and on what I hear on the radio is a lot of unclear messaging. It feels like people mainly read the title of the report and maybe the index, but that was about it. And it feels like the information is not correct.
Yeah, I read the report as well based on the LinkedIn feeds and tips I got from people that I worked with in the past. The title implies with dark clouds packed together over the cloud, it seems that we should pack our bags and leave the cloud. But when I read the report, I came to some other insights. So maybe we should do an episode about it.
Yeah, let's do an episode where we really dive into the reports. What are they actually trying to say here, and what's the truth and what's just fiction? Let's dive a bit deeper into the actual facts.
Let's do it.
Let's go.
Welcome to the Lead Podcast.
The Lead Podcast, a podcast for leaders in engineering, architecture, and development.
So I read the report, and maybe we should just dive into the report from A to Z. So let's start with the beginning of the report. So why did they write this report? And what they say is the government within the Netherlands, and I think it's all over the place, also in different countries, is using the cloud and especially public cloud more and more.
I think that's a general industry trend that we see, right? It's not only the government, it's companies, everyone is using the cloud more and more.
Yeah, we made different episodes about the shift to the cloud and that more and more companies are moving to the cloud. And this report doesn't say anything really different about it. They really underpin how important cloud is in innovation. How it also can have a lot of benefits for everyone, but also for government to be innovative. They have these great examples of the Ministry of Defense that just needs all this innovation within the cloud platform to stay up to par with the things that are needed from it. So innovation is one of the most important things that is mentioned.
Yeah, and next to that, there's also a push from all the vendors by default, right? So let's look at more of the office applications. Of course, most of the government is actually using this for all of their processes to store documents and all those kind of things. Over the years, we've seen all of these companies moving their stuff to the cloud. All the document storage, if you're running Office, for example, by default, this is moved to the cloud. If you don't take any actions, Office 365 would be your default solution, but thereby putting a lot of stuff in the cloud.
Yeah, I think that sometimes it's just a logical choice, and not only Microsoft with Office, but also SAP. I like this paragraph in the document that says there's basically two options. You can either not do it and not go with your innovation and pace of change, or you move to the cloud. And there is factually not so much in between. There is not hybrid solution in many cases, or the hybrid or on-premises solutions are not updated as frequent as the cloud solutions. So there is a lot of push from different vendors, and especially the bigger ones, towards cloud. And that also made, the trend of governments moving to cloud more and more clear.
It also makes it a lot easier for everyone to make it secure, etc., right? Because these cloud vendors do a lot of stuff for you, also protecting your data, etc. Well, if you have to do everything yourself, all of these tasks are also something that you need to do yourself, right? So I think the government has seen this in the past already, because before 2011, the government said you cannot use public cloud. Okay, 2011, that's quite some time ago. And back in 2016, they already allowed certain departments within the central government to use things like public cloud.
Yeah, with strict regulations, not everything can go to the cloud, especially smaller things, public-facing stuff was fine. But when person data or other stuff that is more secretive could not be in the cloud.
But those were policies created per department, right?
Yeah.
So, and then back in 2022, the first version of a central policy came about for all the departments in the Dutch government.
Exactly, and that was more, yeah, it was actually breaking because all of a sudden the government said, well, it's fine if government ministries use public cloud, of course, still within certain boundaries. The real secretive data could still not go into the cloud. But for many things that are in the public domain, for taxes or municipalities, and even in some cases personal data, it was allowed to go to the cloud. But one very important thing, and that is also what the rest of the report is about, within strict regulations and very clear considerations of how and when to use the cloud.
Yeah, so the report underpins that the cloud is a useful technology and should be used by the government in certain cases and can help them build better IT solutions.
Yeah, what I read even in the summary in the first pages was cloud is good. Cloud is really innovative. Cloud can be used, has its use for governments as well, but it needs to be used correctly and in a safe way with a clear considerations of all the risks and challenges that come along with the use of cloud. And that is what the report is all about. How do these governments or the ministries deal with the risks and the challenges? Because that is actually the topic of the report. The government in this report says, well, they do not deal correctly with risks and challenges in many cases.
Yeah. So let's first dive into what are these risks that we need to look into. So what they did for the report is look at over 1,500 workloads within the central government in the Netherlands, and then look at how did these departments look at the risks and challenges that the cloud has or IT solutions have in general, and how did they cope with these kind of things. So there were basically three important categories that should be evaluated, right? So first of all is a risk about sovereignty. And sovereignty means that how much are you in control as government or owner of the data? How much insights do you have in who is using the data? How is this data used? For what purposes
who
is it
can
used?
access the data?
Yeah. And do you have insights on everything that happens? And of course, within the cloud, someone else is managing this for you a lot. So within the cloud, you have this public cloud vendors like Microsoft or Amazon that play a part in this. So that's something that you need to take into account.
Yeah, and a lot of cloud vendors now also have the idea of a sovereign cloud, or the sovereign cloud. I think AWS has a sovereign cloud already. I think that Oracle already has a government cloud or a sovereign cloud. Microsoft is working on a sovereign cloud, and that all means that it is a specialized place within the cloud, a special place in the data center, or maybe a separate data center that is differently arranged than the real public-facing cloud.
Yeah, because that's the most important reason why this is happening is that most of the large public cloud vendors, the hyperscalers, are all American companies.
Yes.
Right? And that's where there's a bit of a thing that you need to take into account. If this data is owned by a company registered in the US, and we have all these regulations that the US, with the Patriot Act, they actually could have access to your data, because the American government has its rule that if they really want to, they can put a request into American companies to provide certain data.
Yeah, the Patriot Act is where it all started. We are now already in the Cloud Act, which is the Patriot Act plus some additions to it. Because what is also interesting is that this whole Patriot Act or Cloud Act or Freedom Act, as it was called over the years, there was always a European counter act against that. So we started out with the Patriot Act, where after 9/11, America said, we want to go into the data. It should be possible for us to analyze data to overcome terroristic attacks, etc., etc. But then it implied that a lot of data, especially also from government and personal data from other countries, landed in the US.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden were open for the US to access that. Of course, regardless if they did it or not, on paper, they were able to do it. They were justified to do it by law. So in Europe, there came Safe Harbor Act, which prevented that kind of things. And that is for European data, it was not allowed, or it had to do all kinds of extra regulation. But that Safe Harbor Act was declared, not legit in 2015. So then a new act came, the Freedom Act in the US, and then the European Union came with something else. It called the Privacy Shield, which had the same things.
Purpose.
Same purpose
to shield certain data that resides in Europe to be viewed by American government on request.
Exactly,
right?
but that was also declared non-legit. And now we have the Cloud Act, and now in Europe we have a new act that's called the EU-US Data Privacy Framework. But that, it's not declared non-legit, but in the end, probably it will in a certain time, but then something else will come and something else will come. But I think the best conclusion, and that's the most important conclusion of the report, is that in the end, regardless of the laws and acts that are in place right now, US can still access data from American companies like Microsoft and AWS and Google if needed. Of course, there need to be all kinds of rules and regulations, but they can still do it.
Yeah. Of course, that is a risk, but there's also things like auditability, etc. And in the report, they also checked how often did this happen. They requested that at the big cloud providers, and they actually responded to this. I think AWS answered with, we had no requests yet.
Yeah.
And I think Microsoft had the most requests. I think it was like 12.
12 requests over all these years, but they didn't know if it were European requests or maybe other requests.
No, it was just in general by the US government to see certain data of Microsoft. And this could be all kinds of requests. They didn't elaborate on the details of this. It could be of a certain company. It could be of a certain government. But it is something to take into account. But the report does not add any conclusions to this. It's just that it is a risk that you need to take into account.
You need to think about it. My data is maybe somewhere in the US, or is in the end owned, even if it's on European soil, it is still owned by a US company. So it might be possible to access the data. And then there is risk mitigation as everything in place. Do we want this? Is it worth the risk, or is it not worth the risk? And the report doesn't say anything about it. It's more like, consider the risk and make sure that you know about it and have a real good mitigation in place if that is the case.
Yeah, one thing that was not in the report, but that was really on my mind, is that we are using American technology that's built in the US. It might also work better for people in the US than on Europe. Now in the whole AI space, this week there was a lot of news about DeepSeek, a Chinese new AI solution that is really trained on the Chinese values and the Chinese view on the world. So if you would ask certain questions that European or American people have different views on, it would respond in a way that you would not expect. Those same things happen for solutions that are built in the US that might not be that visible to us because we share a lot of the same values.
Yeah, exactly.
But you don't know, right? You don't have insights in using these things. What is being used and what's not being used. We just use it because it works. But those are also things that you could take into account when you look at sovereignty.
Yeah, and what I also liked about the whole sovereignty chapter or paragraph, as you may, it was not all bad, because they also had the nice example of, for example, the Ukraine that moved all their data into the cloud, to the public cloud outside of Ukrainian soil, just because there is a war going on in the Ukraine.
Yeah. So
and they said, well, we are so afraid of attacks on our data centers and our core infrastructure. We are moving it outside of our country, which is, of course, a risk because our data is now somewhere else.
Yeah.
But the risk outside is smaller than that we are being attacked by, in this case, Russian state actors, or even just bombardments on the data centers, and that they lose all the data. So they are really open to it. There is no real judgmental thing there. It's more like you need to be aware of where your data is, and can you still keep up with the request and the things, the needs of the civilians within the country.
Yeah. So maybe enough about sovereignty. Let's have a look at the second risk that needs to be taken into account. That's continuity.
Yeah.
And I think that's a quite clear thing. As a government, you want to provide services to your civilians, and you want to guarantee that you can keep doing this, right?
Yeah.
So you don't want to be too dependent on certain vendors, for example. And of course, when you move into a cloud, it's quite easy to really dive deep into using certain services that are only usable in that cloud.
Yeah, I think the dependence goes multiple ways. I see two. So first of all, it's really on the technical service thing. Are you using stuff that can only be used in that cloud? And what happens if, I don't know, the actor, in this case, for example, Microsoft or AWS, goes bankrupt, or whatever cannot be used anymore? Then you are so reliant on that piece of technology that you cannot easily move away from it. And that is a big risk for your civilians, because then core infrastructure services within your country cannot continue anymore. So that's a big risk. And the other one is more on the financial side. If you place all your bets onto one single vendor, and well, you cannot move away very simple from that vendor. Yeah, well, they can charge you whatever you like, and then you need to pay it. Otherwise, you are bankrupt, and that is a big financial risk. And I think it is not unique for cloud vendors.
No, I was thinking the same. If you look at on-premises data centers, you often use certain technology by a certain vendor. It could be things like VMware or Citrix. Those kind of also American companies, they might provide certain services for you on your own hardware. But if you have a conflict with them and you don't pay your bills, they could also shut down those services, right? So is it really something that is only something for cloud? I think not, but it is a good risk that the report tells us about, something that you need to take into account and have a look at what are the risks that we want to take here, or should we maybe build something on multiple public clouds? Just taking the risk into account is what is key.
Yeah, and I think it's the fun thing is that they also have an example of a supplier that went bankrupt. In this case, Atos Origin, the service provider of many government parties here in the Netherlands. And they have consultants or people that work for governments maintaining and operating infrastructure. And all of a sudden that company went bankrupt. So it had nothing to do with the data centers or the infrastructure and what it was running. It was just the people working for a company that suddenly did not exist anymore. And that was a big risk. So I think this whole continuity, vendor lock-in, dependency is much broader than cloud. Only in this report, they focus heavily on cloud. Like, governments are not totally aware of the risk they put when they choose one or two cloud vendors and move all their data estate and infrastructure estate into that cloud. And the dependency that it brings, that they are not aware of that. So they need to be more careful about it.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the last big risk that they talk about, which is data protection. And of course, we read about data leaks and all those kind of things in the news all the time. And I don't think it's really related to cloud specific. It happens to all kinds of data that's being accessed by humans or is exposed to the internet. But it means data protection. We need to have a certain guarantee that our data is protected in a certain way. So I cannot query your personal data that the government has. And I think the cloud has two ways of either helping with this, but also being a certain risk. Because the cloud vendors, they spend billions on actually doing all kinds of building solutions for data protection, network protection, all those kind of things. Accessing a hyperscaler data center is a lot more complex than just visiting a local data center, for example, right? Because they know we have data here from a lot of governments, a lot of companies, banks, etc. So we need to protect this very well, and they spend the money on it. On the other hand, they are big attack vectors, right? If you can hack Microsoft or AWS or Google, you can get access to a lot of data.
Yes. And I think that is the biggest thing the report also says. Like, yeah, it's not so much, in this case, Microsoft Office 365 that is unsafe. Even they even have a table where it says it never had a serious security incident. There were some stuff, but yeah, the question is, was it Office 365, or was it, well, the people that used Office 365 and maybe the ministry or governmental rules and regulations and processes that were actually not so good, so that it allowed it to be hacked. But because the vendor is so big and it's so visible and it's so big of an attack vector, yeah, they are constantly under fire, even more than maybe the governments. And especially they mention state actors, Microsoft and also Google and also AWS. Well, they are a big victim of state actors that want to hack these systems because there is so much valuable information there. Yeah. And I think that is something to be aware of, because in the report also, it even starts with the conclusion on top that says the cloud, probably it's more secure than any other thing, because there is so much people, there is so much investment going on in these hyperscalers that it's big.
Yeah, but I think the cloud offers you solutions to make it very secure, but it does not have to be secure, right? And I think that brings us to the findings of the actual document. They talk about these risks, sovereignty, continuity, data protection. The findings are not that the government is lacking solutions to these problems.
Yes, and it's also not saying that cloud is unsafe or cloud does not have the possibilities to be safe or whatever. And I think that is where the title of the report is very much misleading, because dark clouds are packing over the cloud implies that cloud is unsafe and that we should move away from it because these risks cannot be mitigated.
Yeah.
But the findings in the report are actually something else.
Yeah, so what the findings say is that these risks, you should assess them before you use the cloud, before you actually build any IT system. These things are things that you need to take into account, create an assessment on, and make your decisions.
Make your
based
decision
on-
either to go to private cloud, to public cloud, or maybe choose a hybrid solution, or maybe do it on-prem, but not automatically go to cloud.
Yeah.
And one of the first findings, and I must say I was a little bit shocked there. One of the first findings is the ministries have a limited visibility on cloud usage. So they don't know of 26% of the workloads they have. They actually don't know if it is in the public cloud or in the private cloud or somewhere on-prem. They actually don't know. They just use it. And where it is, where it stands, who is responsible for it, who owns the data, etc., etc. They just don't know it.
Yeah, that was my biggest eye opener for this report. I thought before I start reading it, they would go into these different risks and actually assess these risks for their different departments, etc. But that was not the case, because they didn't even know for certain for 26% of the solutions on where it even ran. So I think it starts there, having insights in these things before you go to the cloud or before you build any IT system. You want to look at certain risks and take a decision based on certain
and again, I think it stands totally separate from cloud or having it in a data center or using it on-prem in your own servers. You need to know which applications you are using, where they are running, on which infrastructure are they secured, etc., etc. If you don't know, then everything can happen. I think that is that is the biggest problem of all, regardless of cloud or whatsoever.
Yeah, and that, combining that with that cloud is found useful, also by this report, is what shocked me as well, is that the government does not have any central view on how to use the cloud. A centralized cloud strategy is still missing. They have certain views per department within the government. There's not one big central view for it.
Yeah, and I think that is also, on the other hand, quite logical, because if you look at when public cloud was allowed in 2022, from 2016 till 2022, it was allowed per ministry, per use case. So it is not strange that a lot of these different governmental bodies or ministries created their own cloud policies and their own things. And of course, there were some manuals and some guidance from the central government how to do it, but there was no big overall thing. And that since 2022, it's now allowed.
Yeah.
But then,
it will take some time before we actually get this centralized strategy. And something else that was missing is there's also not centralized government contracts with these big cloud vendors.
Not completely. There are parties that do that, but not everybody is actually using those.
Yeah, okay. That's a good remark. So there are still a lot of departments that have their own contracts, their own, also spending a lot of money on making all those regulations, etc., and deals with the cloud vendors, while there is already work on centralized.
And as you might remember from the FinOps episode that we did a while back, is you can save a lot of money when buying stuff upfront with the big vendors. And I think the most important conclusion of all is that the lack of strategic risk assessment. And I think we talked about the sovereignty, continuity, and data protection, and the biggest conclusion that maybe covers it all is that that assessment of the risks that come with those three topics, it's not done properly, or not completely, or not always. And I think that's major, because then it doesn't really matter if you go to the cloud or do the data center. You need to be aware of what you are doing. Who owns the data? Who can access the data? What happens if that party that we are hosting at is not able to continue, or we cannot continue with the party. Is there a good exit strategy? All that stuff. Yeah, you need to think about that up front, because when, the shit hits the fan, you are too late.
Yeah, I think this is a conclusion that not only works for the government, it's ties down for every company, basically, right? So, well, concluding the report, I think maybe we could also have a quick look at like the industry and how is the industry moving towards these kind of things, because there's a lot of things happening in the world currently. So these things about sovereignty, etc., is also top of mind for a lot of people, not focusing only on cloud, but also the vendors are seeing this request, so they're also moving more towards this. You already mentioned that AWS was working on sovereign cloud. Microsoft already has sovereign landing zones solution. So what that does is it adds some extra hopes for mitigating data residency, etc., those kind of things. But in the end, we're still talking about this Patriot Act, Freedom Act, etc. In the end, it boils down to, if you have stuff at an American company, the government has certain ways to access it, and adding extra hops might make it more difficult, but it does not guarantee certain things, right? So
no, and I think that our industry also has these open standards now. So the cloud native standards that are there. The big companies and the big hyperscalers are all working together to build a more transparent and agnostic technology stack, so that you can move freely. Not freely in between brackets, but it is possible to move your stuff from cloud to cloud with all the multi-cloud strategies. I think the industry is actually also very aware of that this is happening. And I think, and that is more a personal opinion, that is not in the report whatsoever, but I think with all the geopolitical stuff that is going on right now all over the world, with the elections in the US, elections in South America, also in China, there is a lot of things moving, and the European Union is also scratching behind the ears on, we need to take stand a little bit more against, other players outside of the EU. So I think that a lot of things will already happen, but the big cloud vendors, eventually there is only one goal for them, and that is to make more money. So I think that, important times are coming up right now.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the whole cloud native movement would make it maybe easier for new cloud vendors to also step into the game, because a lot of these solutions are centrally open standards that you have to implement in your own cloud, right?
Yeah.
So also making it easier to move from one cloud to the other. Of course, easier is still something that could be very complex if you have a lot of data and a lot of complex systems.
Yeah, and to be very honest, there is no true European alternative right now for the big hyperscalers. Of course, there are some initiatives in Germany and in France, and I read something about Nextcloud, and in a few years back was Gaia X. There are also kind of European alternatives, but they are so small in comparison with the big hyperscalers that the question that I have, is it a true alternative, or is it something that is only existing on paper?
Also, when you hear about the investments in the US happening by those hyperscalers, and then the money that the EU puts into it, it's hard to compete to these companies.
Yeah.
But in the end, summarizing the report, I think we both liked what the report said.
I found it a very good report. Yeah. Very well written.
The only thing I really disliked was the title, because it did not align with the actual things in the report.
Yeah, it felt a really bit like clickbait, and even after reading, it even felt more like clickbait, because I found it really sad, because the report was really good. It was well written, it was well founded, it was really, really nice, good research, but then the title, it doesn't cover the contents of the report, which is kind of sad.
Okay. So with that, let's close this episode. I think some final remarks. What the report said is the cloud is a viable solution. Use it for what it's good for, but please do your risk assessment before you use anything. And of course, this report focuses on the cloud, but it basically goes for every vendor or tool or stuff that you want to use within your IT solutions. Look at the different risks and how impactful are they.
Yeah, so we will include the link to the report in the show notes.
Yeah.
Please read it yourself. It's a Dutch report. We are very aware that we are now talking about a Dutch report. So if you're listening from outside of the Netherlands, maybe you can go into some cloud service to translate it and read it for yourself. But also, I'm very curious, so please let us know, what do you see in your own country, which is not the Netherlands, in terms of governmental regulations and cloud usage? Because this is very Dutch oriented, but I can imagine that all these topics play also outside of the Netherlands. So please let us know.
Yeah, and of course, these risks do count for everyone in every country.
Exactly.
And this report just focuses on how the Dutch government focuses on using those, which is not enough.
Exactly.
That was the
conclusion of the report in a nutshell.
TLDR,
Yes. So thank you very much for listening. I really liked doing these kind of episodes because it allows us to dive a little bit deeper into these kinds of reports. Let us know what you think, and hope to see you again.
Yeah. See you all, and I hope you listen again in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Lead Podcast, a podcast for leaders in engineering, architecture, and development.